Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome, and thanks very much for taking the time to be here. So, as Brendan said, I'm Caroline McGregor, and I'm Director for ILAS. So, for those of you who don't know the building, we're just across the road, and delighted to be having this seminar in partnership with our esteemed colleagues here in CÚRAM. And Claire will talk a little bit more about sort of, I suppose, many dimensions to our partnership. And one of them is sharing our learning around research policy engagement. So I'm just going to say just a few words. I suppose this is one of a number of events that we've had. I think we've really upped our momentum over the last few years, collectively thinking about different aspects in terms of research engagement, research policy engagement, evidence for policy, public engagement, a number of kind of intersecting themes. And you know, we've a lot done, and yet we've a lot to achieve. And I just took some time thinking about today, to sort of a couple of key messages that I've sort of picked up from the work to date that sort of can help to maybe just kind of start us off thinking about what are we about here today. And I suppose, you know, there's so many dimensions to research policy engagement, and a lot of it comes in terms of evidence for policy, and how we here in our research activities and produce evidence, produce data through the range of amazing work that we do in a way that can directly influence policy. And I suppose one of the key messages I've learned is the need for a diversity of evidence. So it's not that there's one type of evidence that's necessarily better or more suitable for influence in policy than another. It's that quality and diversity. But one, I suppose, of the key messages for all of us is the need for more evidence to be produced in a more engaged way through public engagement, through the fantastic work of our colleagues, for example, in PPI Ignite and other forms of public and citizenship engagement, as well as practitioner policy engagement. So that, I think, is sort of the current new challenge, not so much the way we do research, but who does it and how we involve people in that way. And so in many of these events, we often talk about systems. I think one of the challenges when we're looking at engagement, for example, between university infrastructures, research centres and political infrastructures, is that they're a bit different. Would you say? Yeah, slightly. So like it takes a long time for often our university projects to find their way from conception to ethical approval to funding. And then on the other hand, if you're trying to influence policy or you're trying to provide something for a current political issue, it kind of needs to be quick and snappy. And I think definitely there's something about how we work those structures and systems together, and then also how we communicate. I think that's sort of a key issue we need to keep working on in terms of those of us, including myself, who prefer writing a PhD on something than writing one page, and then realising that nobody wants the PhD that sits getting dusty on the shelf. And so it's a different skill. So that kind of collective skills around research communication. And then what's also very interesting for our learning, they're kind of what I call system issues, but there's also dynamic features. So much of this, I think, comes back to some of the fundamentals around building relationships, around mutual respect, around co-learning, around cooperation, and having events like today where we come together to learn from each other and with each other, and to acknowledge that it's not just, they're not single, research policy. Each of them are complex in themselves. So here within this university, the diversity of research and the diversity of disciplines can make interdisciplinary work challenging even among ourselves. And one of the lovely features of working with CÚRAM, many people ask me how, I'm a professor for social work, how I'm working with my esteemed colleagues in relation to medical devices, which I literally know, I know a little bit about now, but it's not anywhere in my specialism. And the reason how is because we have a shared concern that's cross-disciplinary, but we have the mutual respect. Don't always understand each other's language, but we respect and listen so that we understand enough. And that's kind of a really key dynamic feature, which is something that's really, really important. And then the other piece that I think is really important in terms of how do you engage with policy. So, we've had a lot of events, but two very significant events And my colleague here, John Canavan, has led those for our ILAS in relation to public engagement and work with the Department of the Taoiseach. And sort of looking at some of the key messages from those events is really the number of ways that we can engage with policy. We can learn from past mistakes. We can actually work together to look at a policy that didn't work. And we can also obviously influence current policy, but also looking forward for future policy. So lots of different ways that we can do that. So I guess where I'm at today is delighted to have the opportunity to continue to engage. The more you learn, the more you realise you need to learn. I think there is an element of how can we step up, I think, and like those of you who've taken the time this afternoon are, our esteemed colleagues who are leading in many ways in the field and of so much. So how do we build on what we've already learned, and how do we step up? How do we share that knowledge? And I guess how do we do that towards impact, which is really what we're trying to do. So there are just sort of some, I suppose, initial thoughts in terms of kind of where my head is at starting this afternoon. And I want to thank Brendan, and I want to thank Claire, I want to thank Sarah very much for being here, and everybody who's been involved with this event. I'm really looking forward to learning from it. So thank you again for being here, and I'm going to hand over to my esteemed colleague Claire.
Hi, good afternoon everybody, and you're very welcome to the Biomedical Sciences building. My name is Claire Riordan, so I am the Education and Public Engagement Manager at CÚRAM. And so CÚRAM is a Research Ireland Centre for Medical Devices, and I don't know how familiar some of you are with what we do, so I'm going to show you a very short animation to explain what it is we do. But basically our research programme is all about developing solutions to help us all live well as we age with conditions like cardiovascular disease, diabetes or neurological disorders. So let me just bring this up.
In just 3 generations, the world has seen unprecedented increases in life expectancy. Our lives are longer than they've ever been, but our advancing years are often affected by conditions that limit our ability to live whole lives. CÚRAM is a discovery-driven research centre developing medical devices that improve the lives of people living with chronic illness. We bring together those researching, caring for, treating and living with chronic conditions to shape fundamental research into the world's most challenging health issues. Patients give direction to CÚRAM's researchers, doctors and device makers, maximising the impact of our research. Every minute is dedicated to making discoveries that lead to devices that improve the quality of our lives. CÚRAM's wealth is in its people and its relationships with industry, academia and the public. By creating an understanding of the connection between our research and people's health, CÚRAM actively inspires the innovators of tomorrow, strengthening the research ecosystem for the future. We are a keystone in Ireland's thriving medtech ecosystem, enabling the direct transfer of knowledge from discovery to manufacture. Informed by lived experience, CÚRAM's devices promise to improve the quality of life for future generations, assisting us when we need it most.
So CÚRAM, as I said, has a very strong research programme. But beside the research programme, we have a strong industry collaboration, and we have a very strong public engagement programme. And I suppose what we try to do is to provide meaningful opportunities for our researchers to engage with public audiences, to try and create a better understanding of what it is we do in CÚRAM. It's not an easy subject to tackle and to understand. But as researchers, we're also responsible for advocating for our work. And I suppose this is to ensure continued support and ultimately increasing the impact and the value of our work for patients. And one of our strengths, I think, at CÚRAM as a research centre is developing and building these relationships, these networks across academic, industry and clinical institutions. And we were incredibly fortunate to be neighboured by the ILAS Centre. And it's really through collaboration with the Institute for Lifecourse and Society and the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre that we published a white paper in 2022 exploring how medtech researchers and research centres in Ireland can work to help bridge the research policy gap. So the white paper, led by Brendan, who you'll hear from in a second, really, I suppose, aims to includes a couple of key recommendations that highlights the need for more training and raising awareness of the policymaking process, providing networks and knowledge exchange opportunities. So events like today and the events that Caroline has been referring to earlier are hugely important. And we're really appreciative of the relationship we have with our colleagues, because it is open, it's collaborative, and it's really enriching what CÚRAM does in a lot of different ways. So I suppose science advocacy at CÚRAM, what we mean by that, it's really what we're trying to do is to empower our researchers to understand the landscape and how to input and how to, I suppose, as experts in their own field, what is the opportunity they have to input and direct and influence policy in the medical device field. But yeah, that's really all I wanted to say, is to welcome and to say that I'm really looking forward to hearing the speakers and Sarah talk later on. You'll hear from two fantastic researchers who will talk about their own experiences. So without further ado, I'll hand over back to Brendan, who will talk about his own work.
Thanks, Caroline and Claire. So this is lovely to be able to do this today. I'm going to try and keep my talk short, because I really want to hear from Una and Cormac and hear about, I think everybody wants to hear those real world perspectives of what it's like to actually do this, to engage with policy in Ireland and the challenges they face and how you go about overcoming them. And also obviously to hear from Sarah and to hear from the great work that she's involved in the UK in this area. What I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about science advocacy in CÚRAM and how we got that going. I'm going to talk then about how that kind of led to this project that I'm currently involved in and where we are with that. But first I thought maybe it'd be good just to set a little bit of the scene. Maybe this will kind of run... It might ring true or might ring interestingly with our speakers after this, about where we are with things. So this project is funded by Research Ireland, and it's part of a larger pool of funding called the Science Policy Research Programme. And there's projects from Maynooth and from other projects from colleagues here in Galway and in Cork, looking at various elements of how to enhance the research to policy ecosystem in Ireland. And ultimately how to have it that we have more informed, better informed, evidence-informed policy making happening. And really, I suppose when you kind of take a step back and you go, why are we here today? Why do we do this? Because policy affects all of us. I mean, it's such an abstract term, and policymakers are abstract. It's very, I don't know, I find it hard to grasp at times. But no matter whether it's EU policy, local policy, with our local government, or at a national level, which is the focus of our research, it affects us all. So it's really important that we do it. So that sounds great. Then why is it that we have all these problems? Why are there so many challenges with it? Because it's messy. Policy making, policy development is a messy process. When I first came with CÚRAM to do the science advocacy work, and we kind of first started looking at it, I had all these lovely circles and these lovely cycles like we have in research. We have research process cycles. We develop a question, we develop our research design, blah, blah, blah. And we end up with an output, and that's where we go. And of course, it isn't like that at all. So this is from the policy handbook, recently launched policy handbook, which was from the Department of the Taoiseach. This was for civil servants. But I think it's of value for all of us to look at and to read through. I put it up here, one, to show you, I suppose, how complex, how messy these things can be. Two, because this is coming from the government, this is kind of showing you a little bit of what it is like if you're a policymaker to actually go about doing it, the things you need to be considering. So I think it's nice that they're showing us at least the challenges that they're facing. And three, I suppose, to look at this in a positive light, to look at all the spots and all the places around here that our research can influence. There's so many ways that we can engage with the policy process, if you want to call this a process or a mess. Alongside the mess, obviously, there's a lot of other things. I use this quote a lot. It's from a discussion paper in 2021 by Mary Doyle and colleagues, including Dan Carey, a colleague of ours here in And I suppose I focus on this because our study is looking at a researcher, policymaker engagement interactions, but at that real micro level. So what it's like for individual scientists, not what it's like for universities or higher education or funders, what it's like for us. I think all of us on the ground here, I think we're all researchers. So this was from Mary Doyle, and it was a roadmap for kind of connecting better research and policy. And I suppose in terms of like the lack of incentives sometimes, for the lack of awards for researchers engaging with policy compared to maybe scientific impact awards and things like that. The limited knowledge that we have of what goes on with policy, what they need from us, government departments, etc. And that comes from both sides. And then, of course, the lack of training that there is for both on our side and on policy side. So there's nice big gaps for us to be filling with this work. And that was in 2021, that quote. And so this is kind of some of the stuff that's been happening since. And I suppose it's just to give you an idea. And this is more at a higher level, the types of things that have been happening in this to try and enhance this Irish research to policy ecosystem. There's a lot of stuff on there. But the main thing I wanted to focus on was the Impact 2030. So I don't know if you're aware that that's so that's DFERIS. I'll be saying DFERIS a little bit. That's Department of Further Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science. So they prepared this. It was the Ireland's research and innovation strategy. Arising from this, we got the establishment of a research for policy unit within DFERIS. We have now Civil Service Research Network, which brings together all the research leads across all the departments to something that you would think would have been happening a long time, but it's something that is, and it's great that it's happening now. We also now, as you might have heard last year, we have a government science advisor, and we have a national science advice forum that's in its infancy. And we have other initiatives in Ireland. And obviously at an EU level, there's a lot of things going on, the European Science for Policy ecosystem mechanism piece. And there's a lot of things going on all the time. But you'll notice as well, of course, I put our white paper that Claire mentioned up there because why wouldn't I? My name's on it. And also because it is focused very much on that individual level. And it's the reason why we chose our study. And I suppose I just wanted to delve into that a little bit. But the reason why I want to delve into it is to kind of bring you around to our way of thinking, that sounds very leading. Give you an idea of what we're thinking about in terms of using and, once again, exploiting isn't the right word, but engage research practices and maybe the benefit of employing these for more effective policy interactions. So this is one of the slides we would have used all the time. If you've been to any of these talks that I've done before, I generally do this, and I'm sorry if you're sick of seeing it. But I just wanted to really highlight it because I'd say one of our underlying principles, Caroline, with the work we're doing right now is to look at what's already been done out there. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. And I think this really highlighted this process of figuring out what we meant by science advocacy, what it entailed. And very quickly we realized we're not looking at a new set of skills or things like that. If you're an engaged researcher, if you work with community partners, patients in PPI, for example, or citizen science, you're doing a lot of this type of work. You're developing these skills. As we say, it's science communication in another form. So it's just another audience, really, in a way. But when I say that, it sounds a bit light because science communication, maybe we think of as one-way interaction. What we're talking about here is science communication as it is now, not as it was. Science communication 20 years ago, certainly maybe for lab-based science, you would go to a school once a year, you would do an experiment, you would leave, you would tick your KPI, you've done your outreach, and that was that. Whereas now, to use the example of the schools, we have the Teachers in Residence program here at CÚRAM, run by Sarah there at the back, and the work that they do in co-creating resources with teachers, with students, with scientists together in the schools, in the labs. It's a bi-directional flow. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about science advocacy. It's what we talk about when we talk about meaningful interactions and engagement with people. And just finally as well, something that I always try and remind myself of is this piece in the left corner here about it being a continuum. So it's not a binary thing. And I think when I first started in PPI, and I've been working in the PPI space a while now as well, I thought either it was one or the other. Either you did it or you didn't. And to me, that was quite intimidating. It just felt like a lot. And you see people and they can do such great work in PPI. But then it was only from talking to Martha, talking to Adele and working with them that you realise that it is a continuum. It's on a spectrum and you can work towards it. You can take steps towards having more meaningful engagement with people throughout the research process. And I think it's the same with science advocacy. as I use the example many times, it's not a binary between either you're in your overused metaphor of the ivory tower. Like when I started in academia, I always had this idea that I'd be in my ivory tower with my tweed jacket, leather patches, pipe I had in my head. I didn't smoke a pipe. And I always had a thing that I have a kettle in my office, so I can make tea for people. Obviously what was I saying? Oh yeah, so that's, we have this idea that you're either doing that or you're in a tractor barging down the gates of the Dáil Éireann, and those are the two options you had in terms of engaging with policy. And of course it isn't that. There's so many things that we can be doing in this space. And so this was just some of the findings that came out of our white paper, and I'm not going to go through them all, and Claire's mentioned a few of them already. I just want to look at these when we look again at that idea of using engaged research methods and skills, and how much these reflect well on this idea of science advocacy. And as I said, this is kind of where the spark came about in terms of us designing our research. If you go to Martha over in PPI Ignite, or if you go to Martha in PPI Ignite in Galway here, and you ask her, what do we need to do for PPI? The first thing to say, if you can, plan it early. Try and bring people in at the start. This is what we're saying for policy impact. It's about planning early, involving, informing, engaging. Obviously, with PPI, with engaged research, it's about forming meaningful partnerships based on trust, openness, and I would say as well from our own research and the interviews that we're currently slowly getting into now with our work, we're finding that relationships are so key to effective engagement with policymakers. Obviously, as we say, communication skills are vital. Non-academic collaboration is vital. And I just wanted to point this one thing out, because it was only when I was looking at it this morning that I thought about it. We had this piece for effective science advocacy around kind of like considerations for yourself. And I think these are things, I go to the PPI summer school every year, and these conversations happen all the time about the need for researchers and PPI contributors to take care of themselves and to be, and I think there's something really interesting there, I think, for policy engagement about looking after yourself, but also for engaged research. And then, of course, like everything we do in research, like everything that gets done in policy, it takes time. I'm not going to talk about this too much. This was just that piece, the kind of larger piece around how do research centres support policy engagement or effective science advocacy, say. But the reason why I brought this up is we ran, as we said, we've run a few different kind of events through the years, with researchers in CÚRAM and ILAS, and looking at the practical on the ground experiences, looking to provide networking opportunities. And I just wanted to highlight this one particular event we had, which was the first time that we had ILAS researchers and CÚRAM researchers coming together. I think this was the year before last, I think. Yeah. We met during the summer. We had a half day here. Some people that were here were there, and it was just a lovely day where we had an open discussion around what would PPI for policy impact look like. And it was just a chance to meet people and to chat and to talk about each other's research. And we had guest speakers from both sides coming and talking, and it was just a lovely day, and it just really sparked my own curiosity in this idea of, well, how can we use engaged research? And I should say as well, and this is a lovely example of it today again, just the amount of commonalities we have. And I know we talk about, and Caroline, I'm the same as you, I haven't a clue what medical device is, and I've been here for years and I don't know what's going on. But there's so many commonalities in the challenges we face. And so we do all deal with a lot of the same challenges, and we have to overcome these, and we can learn a lot from each other. So quickly then about our team and what we're doing. We have 2 years. We're Research Ireland funded. As I said, we're looking at it through the micro level perspective of individual researchers. We're delighted now to have Lucy joining the team with us. And we have Caroline and John here, and we also have Fergal Lynch, who's a very experienced senior civil servant. He spoke here at one of the science advocacy events before, and he's helping us with the project and kind of helping us with that policy side of things, that messy piece we talked about at the start. That's what he's helping us with. And we have 3 interrelated work packages, which I'll talk about in a minute. I'm not going to go through these because they're just a big load of words, but I just kind of threw these down so you kind of have a better idea what the kind of things that we're interested in within our project. First and foremost, we want to explore this idea of engaged research practices and methods and skills, and how these could inform policy engagement, how they could potentially lead to more significant policy impact. Obviously, we'll talk about what we're doing, but we want to find out those pathways to policy impact. We know so much already, but I think there's still more to be found and where we are right now with it. And those, I think those informal piece, the invisible engagement, those things that we don't really talk about, that you don't see when you read a case study about policy impact. They don't talk about those invisible or informal interactions and engagements. Specifically then, and I think maybe this is what's unique to our project, out of those projects I mentioned that are happening at the moment, we want to look across the career life cycle. I'm still an early career researcher and I haven't a clue how to engage with research. So I'm hoping to find out a lot. And I'm hoping that we can provide some real guidance for the next generation of researchers. So I really want to, so we're going to be engaging with early career researchers and established researchers, if they've engaged with research at all, why they haven't done it, why they do it, across disciplines, looking at those commonalities and differences across disciplines as much as we can. There's one piece up here I didn't put as well. We want to look at challenges for people coming to Ireland to work here and to work as researchers, and the unique challenges that they're facing as well. So as opposed to growing up in Ireland and through the Irish education system and having a neighbour or whoever that can connect you with somebody in the government department, how do people do it who are coming here to work and to carry out research? Because we all want to have impact with our research, and that's why we're all here. So that's another angle that we're looking at. And as I said, we want to offer training and support and guidance for the next generation researchers. And we also want to look at, and I suppose this is my own area of particular interest, is impact and evaluation. And how could we, what insights could we provide for funders in terms of how can you actually support better policy engagement? What are the indicators maybe that are of use that they need to promote more? I'm nearly done. I have 2 more points. 3 more points. Yes. Sorry, just quickly, this is our method that we're using at the moment. We're in the process of carrying out interviews with a cross-section of academics across universities and technological universities. So it's all over Ireland. We're also going to be interviewing engaged research leaders. So we have engaged research leaders. It's people that are active in the space around Ireland, and to talk to them about our theories and to see what they think and the challenges that are obviously there. I haven't talked about challenges, but there obviously are going to be some. Then work package 2 will be a national survey. We see this as kind of almost a flash survey. It's going to be very short. 3 minutes is what I have in my head to try and get people to actually answer it. But to kind of see, maybe to get a bit of a sense check on what we're doing, if we're going in the right direction, and to look across those various strata. I would say as well, there are surveys going out. I heard there's one out today from one of our colleagues. If you can, please do try and answer them if you get a chance, because these programs, we're all doing slightly different things, but I think there's a combined impact of our group, of our projects together, that could be really interesting. So if you can, please do fill out those surveys and all the other surveys that you've probably gotten in your inbox today. And another unique part of our study is we're dedicating basically year 2 to further consultation and dissemination of our draft findings, and basically doing a kind of sense check with the other people that are, and I haven't talked about, the public bodies. I haven't talked about CSOs yet, or charities. And so the idea will be to engage with them in year 2 and to see how do these chime with their experiences, and obviously policy audiences, civil servants, etc. Very quickly, I just wanted to say, why are we looking at engaged research? Maybe it's obvious to most people, maybe not, I don't know. I just focused on the benefits for research. So to do engaged research, it increases the relevance of research, the quality. It increases transparency, public trust in science, and it has massive potential for impact. So we want to see, what does it do for policy impact? I just highlighted this as a quote, but just if done well and over time. So it's that idea of you need to stick at it. It's about sustained engagement. And then also that idea for all participants. And I'm talking about benefits of engaged research for research, but obviously there's benefits for everyone involved in the process, not just the research, and to be so selfish as that. And once again, coming back to just this quote, I suppose, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're trying to add to what we already do. 2 more slides. Did I talk too long? Is it okay? My second last slide. So this is just another piece from that policy handbook I mentioned. So the policy handbook was actually launched. It was only launched in May, just across the road in ILAS at our last event. And we're delighted to have everyone down. I would say, as I said, it's worth giving it a read. I think it's quite practical. It's quite forward facing. And I suppose just to look at this with the idea of engaged research in your head, and to think about, how could an engaged research project, and this is maybe overly simplified, and obviously I'm not thinking about all the challenges that are there, but how could an engaged research approach impact on these different areas. So obviously there's the three pillars that they have now: data and evidence. Well, we researchers, we're going to have the data and we're going to provide the evidence. Feasibility and implementation, the thought of having people that are affected by the research involved in the process is going to automatically increase the feasibility and the implementation potential of it, is what I'm hypothesizing. And finally, legitimacy. And legitimacy is all about buy-in. And if we're having the public involved in our research, if we do it well, we're going to have buy-in. So I think there's something really interesting there, and particularly on these first of their 5 Ds, the demand for policy, deepening understanding, and design with best advice. These are all areas that I think engaged research can influence. And finally, before I finish, myself and Claire were saying we're going to try and do another one of these science advocacy, these events between ILAS and CÚRAM. This is something else that's going to be happening, and we'll definitely be engaging with everyone. I just found out on Monday we got funding for this. It's an Enlight Plus award, so it's going to be a seminar series across 3 universities, Comenius in Bratislava in Slovakia and Ghent University in Belgium. They work in very different areas, but they are really interested in training researchers in engaging with policy. So we'll be looking at how they do that in a national context and what we can learn from each other. So we'll have them visiting us and we'll be visiting them. So it might be a nice opportunity too to hear a bit more about this.
The story is about researching sustainable lab practices, and I've got some images just thrown up here. I can't describe all of them in detail, but the top left-hand one is a screen grab of a YouTube video that was made back in 2019, 6 years ago almost to the day, since we got our Green Lab certification. I'm going to mention that in a second. And just, it kind of went viral, at least in Irish terms. You know, it did the rounds and SFI found out about it. And on the same day we got the certification, we were up on the platform at the SFI Summit, we being the CEO of My Green Lab. So we'd recertified, that's what the thing in the middle is, and then we got involved in plastics, circularization from lab products and things like that for a while, and then Irish Green Labs, and finally we got some EU expert support. So a lot of things have been happening. But why is it worth doing it all? The reason is that, in fact, it's 21 years since the International Institute of Sustainable Laboratories was set up in the US, because there was a recognition that all of those Ivy League universities in the US, you know, Harvard and ones like that, the buildings that were using the most energy were the ones that had the most labs in them. So that became clear, and the reason that was set up was to try and save energy. And, you know, they'd be using maybe up to 10 times more energy than the office space. And it's the same here, right? Same thing like a freezer, an ultra low temperature freezer, which for us has been for years at -80. But let's say even at -70, it is the same energy that's used as an average Irish household. I've done measurements myself. And then your fume hoods, you know, for extracting chemicals and things like that you're working on, 2.5 houses. We have a lot of these, even here. Every university in Ireland does. And then there was a study done in the University of Exeter back in 2015. It got like 1 column in the Nature journal in 2015. It's probably the most cited article. Researchers in the University of Exeter, 280 of them, were on average, they could be generating 1,000 kilograms of plastic waste per year. Okay, it's mind blowing, right? In 2013, a My Green Lab was set up by an ex-neuroscientist called Alison Paradise. She's the one who came over and gave us the cert. Impact Laboratories is now set up as a subsidiary that measures impact. The important message here is that in 2021, a collaboration started between My Green Lab and the UN in the race to zero emissions. And when these societal high-level champions, an Englishman and a Chilean, they defined single outputs from 30 societal economic sectors, global sectors, just 30 of them. And in the pharma and med tech sectors, they said 95% of all pharma and med tech companies should do My Green Lab certification by 2030. And then all of them after that, right? What that meant was they saw the value of doing this. Now, that's been incredibly useful for people like me who are kind of advocating for doing this. So that's the main message there from that slide. But the timeline is, again, back in 2019, getting the certification. What transpired was, yes, this is an American organization, but it turned out that CÚRAM was the first lab in Europe to get the certification. And then, of course, it just went mad after that, this was a surprise to me as well, because I just thought, oh, this is cool. We should do this. That was kind of how it got started. But it has changed my life, actually, in general, for the better. It's made me very busy. But immediately what happened, because of the social media and SFI and all that sort of thing, being at the summit. But anyway, there already existed about a year before that, the SEAI, which is the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, had a working group for public sector labs that had been set up for that reason. So they wanted to say, what's going on in the labs? We need to cut down on energy use. And they got wind of that and they invited me to give a talk. And then they said, oh, well, can you chair it? We need a new chair, blah, blah, blah. So I ended up in that back in 2020 for 3 years. But what I was experiencing when I was talking to others about it and trying to kind of expand the uptake of lab greening, even just across this campus, it wasn't like it was welcomed with open arms, put it that way, right? So I couldn't understand why people weren't thinking the same way I was. And, so decided to set up a Green Lab Principles and Practice graduate module, which I've been teaching since 2020 with help from environmental science colleagues and Ian McLaren, who's the next astrophysicist, by the way. So he does the atmosphere and climate piece. But we actually cover a lot of subjects, including the psychology of climate change, sociology, and climate change comms, right? For that reason, anyhow, among other subjects. So that happened in 2020. And at that time, the sustainability strategy for the university was being rewritten. And the greening of all labs on campus by the end of this year, supposedly, is part of the strategy. Now it's part of the strategy for 26 to 2030. And we've about 70 labs doing it now. And because of this involvement and kind of the ecosystem, if you like, or the community of people that I was meeting across Ireland, we got some money from Circulara to try and circularize our plastics. But what I really think is important to emphasize here is the PI sign-off from ABBE. Now, this was incredibly significant. Back in early 2019, when I was standing here talking to all the CÚRAM researchers, I spoke to ABBE first and said, I'm going to bring this up. Can you back me up, right? Basically. So we came into our regular Tuesday meeting. I talked about the My Green Lab certification and said that, CÚRAM was going to go through it. And he just turned around to the room like this and just said, you are all on the green team. And that's highly significant. So a senior person to buy in from the beginning. And as of now, so over the years, what happens is all PhDs have to do My Green Lab ambassador training when they come to the lab. All of the postdocs now have to do a professional accreditation, which is a much deeper, and it's the only professional accreditation for lab greening worldwide. So that's excellent as well. And then Sarah's work on teachers and residents has happened. So there are secondary school teachers. There's one over in Drogheda, I believe it is, Sarah, that has come up with a Green Lab lesson plan for secondary school students, which is great. And then we have a Green Lab PhD, Marie Curie. We have a Research Ireland funded student who's doing sustainability, advocacy and engagement in medtech research, and that's Paola Serrano Bravo. And then we have Gulsanga Lamar, who is a Marie Curie fellow who's also working on the greening of medtech research here. So that, again, through CÚRAM, okay? And then after that, 2022, because SEAI, that group was focused mainly on energy, but the people attending those meetings were saying, well, it's not just about energy, it's all the plastic waste and all that sort of thing. So we decided to set up Irish Green Labs, and we've 39 organisations, and that's all of the HEIs, 10 hospitals, EPA labs, the state labs. So and we've got a handful of corporate entities as well, Medtronic and people like that. And now at the moment there's over 600 labs in the Republic that are pursuing My Green Lab certification. But it is an all-island entity. So north of the border, they tend to go for the LEAF kind of certification. That actually came out of UCL. Yeah. So I do acknowledge that. LEAF got to the north first before I did. So it was a close call, though, I have to say. Now I said that I landed with ILAS in Paradise at the summit in 2019 up in the, before, it was very quick. She had it over the cert. We hopped in the car, we drove across Athlone. And then people in the audience that I knew were going, why is Una talking about sustainability? But anyhow, The output of that, so that was 2020, but it took 3 years to get to this. Do you know what I mean? And this is so that Research Ireland, or at that time SFI, set up its climate strategy, and it's built on 3 pillars, and the third pillar is carrying out research sustainably. So it's all about lab greening, and they paid for 100 labs to get certified, just to encourage. So 100 of their 500 funded labs that are funded by them, right? So that's a start. And they have collected evidence on it. And I believe it's about to be mandated as well for labs that get their funding, which is fantastic. And then after that, there was a report, the 8th National Forum on Education for Sustainable Development, which had that that department that you were mentioning, right, was there. But I gave a talk there in one of the parallel sessions. So that's up there. They know about it. Do you know what I mean? That's as far as it's happened. And then on Tashka, which runs a green campus scheme for all the HEIs, but now it's expanded to hospitals. For the first time, they've introduced a green lab sub-theme. So now that will have an impact, because you have to provide evidence if you want to keep the green flag. You know, it's part of the criteria. So I think that's actually going to be impactful. I forgot to bring up the award thing. There it is. This just happened anyway in 2000. This just happened. This thing came over from the US. So that I2SL this is to CÚRAM. This is to CÚRAM. It's not and I mean, it depended on all of those people. Like Sarah was named in that application, you know, for the teachers and residents thing. Abe obviously is named. And then those students that are, and the researchers that are actually working on it, they're all named in that. And I think it's, you know, like you were saying, Brendan, all of those different entities that have to work together. So that's how that happened. But one quick point, Claire, I squeezed this in. I know I didn't show it to you, but basically one point is, you know, I just keep adding to these, right? And, you know, I shaded in, this is for other audiences, because I've given over 100 talks since this happened. It's been a bit daft. But basically, the ones maybe, as people in the labs, you know, the shaded green, we can maybe influence those people. But you're going to see the policymakers, I haven't coloured that in because I don't know how to influence them. I have no idea, basically. So that's blank. Or the standards, but the policies end up to standard. Like you go from policy to standards, right? Or is it the other way around? I don't know. Like this was one thing I was wondering about. And do we influence certification bodies? I don't know. I haven't a clue. But basically what I did learn was, yeah, there's no clear path for someone like me who just decided to do this. I wasn't asked to do it. It's not part of my job. I mean, it has become part of my job, but you know, so the carrot and the stick were needed. So like I thought, oh, sure, if people get Green Lab certification, then oh, obviously they're going to get funded, you know, or they'll think of it that way. It'll be easier to get funding, but that's not really how it worked out. Geography plays a role. We're in Galway, we're not in Dublin. And I think my understanding from the Dublin Green Lab crowd that I know, they can run over to Leinster House and meet somebody in, you know, in an hour, whatever. So I don't feel like I have any power in policy at all. But the evidence piece, yes, I think that's probably what we will. The seniors and support environment is essential, and lab greening value isn't uniformly recognised. So some people get it, other people don't. Some people think it's important, other people don't. And tailoring the lab greening narratives to each audience, you have to engage emotions as well, especially when it comes to climate. I think it's, well, to anything. Existence of policy isn't enough. This is the other thing. Like it's a policy for the university to green all the labs. Doesn't mean people are going to do it. You know, so I don't know how to fix that. And also, if it's a policy you don't comply, what happens? I've no idea either. You know, so magic wand, government, national support. I don't know. I mean, this is what I've been looking for. Trying to get funding. It doesn't fit any of the calls. Like it's an emerging discipline. That's the language that we're using it. I've been asking SFI to put a Green Lab officer in every HEI. That's what's needed. But it doesn't fall into their call, you know, definitions at the moment. My Green Lab ambassador for all lab associated students. I mean, TUD does that, Technological University of Dublin. All of their first years do that. It's free. It takes half a day. We're in the process of considering setting up Irish Green Labs as a charity. So that's a long process, I understand, so that we can raise money. And then having this support, yeah, I mean, should all of these together fund a 1 FTE to run the Irish Green Labs network? Maybe. sustainability embedded in the lab sector, it should be, because it does have an impact. So in terms of climate action, I think it's, a lot of the time I say lab greening is a stepping stone to climate action. It is, etc. Policy and strategy impacts, mandate penalties for non-compliance, maybe that's the stick. And then national policy drafted. I mean, I just have no idea how to get to that, basically. And I think that is all I have to say.
Thanks very much, everybody. It's nice to be here on the opposite side of the road, as Caroline said, to talk to you about our work and the nature of what we do. So what I want to talk to you about briefly is work that we've been doing over the last 5 to 6 years on something totally different to what we've just heard, but it's about why wellbeing matters, is what we've called it. It was launched back in April, but it's about the concept of alternative education. For those of you that don't know what alternative education is, it's when a child or young person either has fallen out of education or fades out of education or is just about to, and what activities or interventions can you put in place to support them progress their education. So that's the broad kind of context of what it is. It was funded by, in the bottom left there, it was funded by an organisation called Rethink Ireland. And Rethink Ireland is Ireland's social innovation organisation set up to look for innovative solutions to persistent social problems. So that's kind of where we're coming from with all of this. So what I'm trying to do is give you a flavour of what the context is, what we did, and then talk to you about the nature of, well, how might this influence policy, what's our experience of it, and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting journey from that perspective. Just to give you the context of it very briefly, the figure on the left-hand side is that for every child that starts in Ireland in first year of secondary school, about 93% of them or so will finish. And if you break that down into different electoral regions and so on, it's a lot lower. So obviously some regions will have a lot lower success rate, but on average we're talking about 8% of children who start in first year do not finish their senior cycle. So when you think about that in thousands, that's a lot of children over a 10-year period, over a 5-year period. There's a lot of children that potentially fade out of that education system and so on. The green piece talks about PISA. So if you look at it from a PISA perspective and how we measure all of that, Ireland holds up very well when it comes to kind of literacy and numeracy and so on. But the dark blue there is our response from government called the DESH programme, which is a programme that was designed to support children that and communities in less advantaged areas. And when you look at the funding that's spent there, you can still see there's a gap between the mainstream schools, if you want to call it, and the non-DESH. So what we were interested in was trying to understand that gap and understand the nature of how we might do something about that from the research perspective. So along comes Rethink Ireland. They made a call for what they call a fund, and a fund is literally where they offer funding support, but also business support and evaluation support to organisations to come and join them to try and look at what they do in a particular area. So in this case, there were 3 funds created around alternative education. So projects that were engaged or were working outside of mainstream primarily education were invited through a competitive process to be part of this fund. So long story short, they also advertised then for an evaluation of this work to be done, which we applied for and we got here. So as part of the UNESCO Child and Family Research Centre. So there were 39 projects. When I say a project, this could be a project that has 20 young people, young participants in it in a community setting, or it could be thousands of young people, depending on the nature of the intervention and the setting. So on average, we're talking about thousands of young people across the board that these 39 interventions would have worked with and so on. So what Rethink's belief was that out there, outside of mainstream, there were innovative, creative interventions that were doing work with young people to help them progress their education that we didn't know an awful lot about. So there was an evidence gap that Ireland didn't really know much about and so on. So what we were trying to do was, with Rethink Ireland and with the project, we were trying to understand and create a process that would help us to gather that data, that important data, so that we could inform policy and inform the nature of what went on. So the diagram on the right hand side just shows the kind of the timeline of the 3 different funds. So as I said, we just launched in April gone. One of the methodologies we used, we had a mixed methods methodology. I'm a sociologist by background. The team that I had was a mixed discipline team, but primarily in the sociology kind of background as well. But one of the things we used a social return on investment methodology. And again, without getting into the detail of it, what we did with that is we were able to identify, on the one hand, the outcomes that were achieved by participants in these projects. So what we term soft skills. What were the soft skills? Never mind the education for a second. What were the soft skills that were achieved by participants? For example, self-esteem or confidence or better social networks and so on. Why? Because the theory tells us that the more of those things you have, the better able you are to progress in your education. So we put a lot of time into developing what those outcomes were. Through the social return on investment, what you can do then is you can actually put a value on that. So, for example, how much is self-esteem worth in terms of the input, in terms of money and activities that go into that particular intervention and so on. So I'll show you the results in a second. So in parallel to the normal day-to-day education system, all of these 39 projects were working with these children in this particular way, or young people. And for us, and we're happy to be able to say it was the biggest study to date of its kind on alternative education. So you can imagine the amount of data that we generated around that. Here are the high level figures. Again, just to point out is that there was a whole qualitative story that goes on behind this that explains what these figures mean. But just to give you the idea of it, is that for a total cost of 8 million across the nature of those projects, we were able to generate, and the projects were able to generate 145 million in terms of return, social return or social value. So if you think about what you get when you put a few quid in the bank, if you get half 1%, you're happy. There was a 1:8 return here. So for every €1 that was invested, there was an €8 worth of social value. So what does that actually mean? That we could translate the social outcomes that were generated into a numeric or monetary figure that you could then say to policymakers, if you invest in this particular type of activity in this particular way, you're likely to achieve these particular returns, if you want to kind of put it that way. And as I said, more importantly for us, this is what a black box looks like, by the way, in an airplane. So hopefully you never get to see it, but this is what it looks like. What we are also more importantly and more proudly able to do in parallel with the SRY work was we were able to identify the practices and processes of how the actual work was done. So when you think about the idea of kind of a black box, that's what we were able to do, is we're able to identify how and what happened within each intervention so that those outcomes were actually achieved. And that's really important for sustainability of projects over time. I'm not going to dwell on it. You can look at the details. If you just Google why wellbeing matters, you'll find it. We've loads of videos and stuff there that you can look at it as well. So personal reflections. What would we take out of all of this over the last kind of 5 to 6 years that we could offer as a way of kind of learning in relation to all of this? Well, our ultimate goal, when I say we as in Rethink Ireland, ourselves and the awardees of those 39 projects, was first of all to create a coalition of voices so that you had 39 projects coming together that would never have been together in the one room before, because don't forget, these are all apples and oranges projects. They're not related to each other. They don't know each other. They've nothing to do with each other. That's the first thing. And then to create that data that we can say, this is actually what happens in these settings. And for us, it kind of explained, the more we got into it, it kind of explained the hidden nature of this activity, because it hadn't been done before, it hadn't been documented from an Irish perspective before. And with that, then the idea was to inform smart policy development that would have an impact for that 8%, go back to that 8% and so on. So what can we say? Well, the first thing that we'd say is an important consideration is to reflect on how to build a strong relationship ecosystem. And Brenda mentioned it already, I think Caroline mentioned it as well, is that we spent a lot of time in our project developing relationships with the awardees. So us as the evaluation team, we spent a lot of time doing that, going to visit them, talking to them, getting to know their projects, getting to know their participants and so on, really kind of spending time on that. And we also formed a working group. And in reflection, the working group was okay, but it didn't really hit the nail on the head because it only met incrementally. So it met maybe every 3-4 months. So it didn't help us, in the day-to-day kind of activity. And it had kind of a limited role, even though we had a member from the Department of Education involved at the time. So I suppose we're reflecting on it. I think one of the core points that we'd agree on as a team is the need to leave space for the co-design of the actual research project at the very start, so that you sit down with the awardees, as we did, with the funders, as we did, ourselves, obviously, bringing our knowledge, but that, I know it sounds basic, but that you bring and find significant people in that area to bring with you at the very start. We didn't have that. We didn't have that in a coherent way. We had it through the working group, but not in a coherent way that was planned out. We were so busy doing the do of collecting data from 39 projects that we could have spent more time figuring out how to actually do the work of that buy-in from the very start. So, to plan for that, about how you implement kind of that relationship piece at the very start. And obviously, we're fortunate here to have the PPI methodology kind of central to our work, with Martha and Adele, using that approach, as well as with awardees, as using that across the board as a way to engage. So I know it sounds basic, but on reflection, that's one thing that we would do if we were to do this, do different if we were to do it again. The other thing is, this is very much like a very niche area. So it's like within the Department of Education, it has a particular home. And for us, coming from all the different work we've done over the years in education and in all kind of areas in relation to young people and families, or children, young people and families, it took us a while to figure out, the overall, I suppose, niche area, but also how policy happens within education. I'll always remember one of the funny comments that was given to us by a senior person in the department when they talked about policy change in the Department of Education. It was that it's like trying to move a graveyard when you try to make policy change in education. To be aware of that nothing is going to happen tomorrow. It's going to be kind of, very, very slow. So my advice and our advice around this is to get to know your specific policy cycle. What's your policy cycle within whatever area you're talking about? Who sets the agenda? So is it the principal officer? Is it the actual, civil servant 3 rows below that? Who actually sets that? And what are their priorities? Like, when we began that discussion with them, it's interesting to see that their priorities are political. They're not kind of, social, they're political. And that's very obvious. And to what extent then does your research fit that overall kind of piece of the puzzle? So it's a bit like trying to make 2 jigsaws at the one time. You're trying to make sure that they work in the same way. The other thing is keep it in tune with the debates that are happening in the newspapers, on the primetime television shows, all that kind of stuff, that what's going on and how they fit. And that was a real eye opener, that those things had to click. We had to make those things work in order to understand where this thing fitted. Because if we didn't, we wouldn't be confident with what we were talking about and so on. And the very basic level about how can we help policymakers? That idea of building that relationship. But when you understand the policy process, you can understand, well, they might need it at a particular time, or they might need a particular type of information, or in a particular way, or in response to something that exists already. Nearly done. Reflection 3 is, I couldn't emphasize this one enough, is where are we at now? So we launched in April. They were at our launch, as in there was representation from the Department of Education at our launch. We have met with them since and have presented to senior people in the department. And all I'd say is perseverance. Is that resilience, perseverance and confidence. There are a few things there. The policy timelines in this area are extremely slow unless there is a crisis. Unless something happens and some major incident happens, it's going to be a slow drip, drip, drip sort of approach. And that's an important thing, I think, to be aware of. Keeping all channels open to engagement. What I mean by that is that kind of group presentation, group discussion with somebody is important, but there are also discussions you can have at other events with other people and other senior people, or maybe not so senior people, that can bring the thing back up to where it needs to go to as well. And keeping all those options open, just by accident sometimes, but to keep your antenna open or aware of all of that kind of stuff. And I think this is the bit for us, is the perseverance that gets us out of bed in the morning, is that, at the end of the day, when you boil it all down, what are we doing? We're privileged as researchers to be able to represent the voices of people that are forgotten about, and whatever that might be. And in this case, we have the evidence there to show that. So that sense of perseverance about the voice, perseverance, that you're representing a voice, you're using your expertise, your knowledge to try and bring that somewhere, that's important. And our advice would be, don't lose sight of that. Don't lose sight of why you're there. You're not just there because it's a job you're interested in or a methodology. It's because there's a bigger picture here that, so to realise that bit. And to communicate your findings with confidence. Caroline mentioned it, Una mentioned it, that sense of evidence. Like once you have the evidence speaks for itself. If you've used an appropriate methodology, the evidence speaks for itself. And in one sense, you have to let the cookie crumble the way it crumbles and see where it goes in our experience in this particular way. And the last one is around methodological capacity. And it's something that we've become acutely aware of, is the best way I'll put it, is that we trained as SROI practitioners because it's an accredited framework. We'd never used it before. And as far as we're aware, nobody in our department, in the Department of Education, has actually trained in it or knows much about it. So from a perspective of presenting the information to them, they get it, they understand kind of what it's about and so on. But there's a little bit of questioning, I suppose, from their perspective of, well, how likely and how useful is this as a basis for policy making and policy decision? In our case, that's our message, is that if you work in this particular way with these kind of tools and these kind of methods, you're likely to have, this type of outcome. Whereas that penny hasn't dropped yet, because it's not the way that they do their business. It's not their priority yet. It's not the way that they kind of make their decisions on kind of what happens. So I suppose the question mark then is that capacity building piece. Whose responsibility is it? When is it done? How should it be done? Should it be done at all? How do you actually understand that? But that, again, our view would be that has to go hand in hand with producing something like a Picasso painting versus like a Monet. They're two very different things, but still they describe something that can be very similar. So that's it. There are our kind of considerations. Hopefully they're of some use to you. But it was a fascinating journey, and hopefully will be as we go on from this.
But the first thing to say is hello and thank you for having me. It's really great to be here, and it's really interesting to get the opportunity, from a very selfish perspective, just to learn a little bit more about the Irish perspective and the Irish ecosystem. So thank you, and I hope that I can offer you something interesting in return. So I work at University College London, and I've been there for a little longer now than I would like to think. And from quite an early stage was thinking about how to develop our institutional capacity for academic policy engagement. But I think it's quite important to say I did not know what I was doing when I started doing that. It was a newish idea, wasn't really an established agenda, and I just sort of made it up as I went along for quite a while. But it turned out that there was something in it. And so for the last 6 or 7 years, I suppose, I've started to feel more and more like I might know a little bit about what I'm doing. And I've been lucky enough to have the opportunity to lead a couple of projects as well, across like national projects, which really helped to kind of consolidate some of that. But also to, I think, as we were starting to see the agenda rising up, the kind of government and funder priorities. So that's a bit of context. So what I do now is I have a role at UCL, which sounds very grand, thinking about how to really maximise the benefit of the research that we do. And my particular interest is in the societal benefit rather than the economic, clever spin-out stuff, which is not really my bag. And I am also the co-chair of the University Policy Engagement Network in the UK, which is effectively a collective network of universities who all in different ways care about this agenda. But when I say universities and all, sometimes what I really mean is one lonely person, a bit like you, Una, who's kind of plugging away. So it's powerful, but I wouldn't want to suggest that like actually every university in the UK is champing at the bit for this agenda, because they're really not yet. That's what we're trying to change. So this is what I thought I would cover today, give you a little bit of context and background, and then talk about the capabilities and academic policy engagement project CAPE, tell you a little bit about UPenn and what we're up to, and then, just so we're on a nice optimistic note, finish with telling you how difficult everything still is, as far as I'm concerned. But I think we need to start with really, why should we care? Why does this matter? And I suppose I see it in terms of 3 main levels of drivers for this. So at that kind of big societal level, we're investing a lot of money now in research in the UK. Our UK research and innovation budget is set to hit 10 billion a year by the end of the decade. And actually the total budget is 20 billion. So that's a lot of public money. And I think it confers a bit of an obligation to make sure that we're using the money that is creating new knowledge or synthesizing old knowledge, I suppose, to try and address policy problems and societal challenges. There are also, I think, increasing institutional drivers for this. They come and go a little bit. And sometimes it's as cynical as a university wanting to be known for doing policy engagement. Sometimes it's thinking a bit more about the kind of the role and the obligation of the university. And I think also at the very micro individual level, actually, most academic researchers that I work with really care about this. You know, some of them do it, again, for the prestige and the reputation. But fundamentally, I think it comes from this desire to do the right thing. And I think we should just recognise and acknowledge that you know, it's a really powerful force that we have in universities. Increasingly, I am worried, I suppose, about the way that universities in the UK, at least, can sometimes give the impression they think the world owes them a living. I think we are really seeing the risk. In fact, I think it started the erosion of the social contract between public and the universities. So I think that sits over all this for me at the moment, that we really need to think seriously about not just assuming everybody will think universities are a good thing. We have to really prove it and show it. And we have to do that not just for a kind of, well, an elite based in London. You know, we have to do it for the whole country and beyond. But it really matters. And, you know, we can see there are incredible outcomes. If we're thinking about why evidence-informed policy, why using research evidence in policy matters, it's because it drives public health programmes. It's because it's our, you know, future energy sustainability. It's about achieving net zero. It's so we don't all get taken over by robots, but we can think about how we can make use of technology. And it's so we can all eat as we continue to increase the population on this planet. So the outcomes, I think, really matter. And I love this quote from, I mean, it's quite, you know, a long time ago now, this GCSA, but I don't think I found another one who's kind of encapsulated this quite as much. And it can sound really dry sometimes when you talk about it. It's not always easy to bring this agenda to life, which is why I've said it's a bit nerdy, but I think it's fundamentally necessary and we need to get more robust really about making the case for this, making the case for universities to do this. So a bit like Brendan's slide, I wanted to try and gather together some of the kind of key developments in the ecosystem we've got in the UK. Quick plug, we've actually made an interactive timeline, which you can find on the UPenn website, which is quite interesting if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of this. But I would really highlight the formation of the Government Office for Science in 2007. And that was followed very quickly by a report from the Council for Science and Technology that advises the Prime Minister, basically setting out an agenda for closer engagement between academia and government. And that was kind of my light bulb moment where I thought, aha, there's something to do here. That was right before I joined UCL. And then more very significantly for universities in the UK, as you may be aware, is our research assessment framework, the REF, the Research Excellence Framework. So incorporating a sense of impact assessment into that, including social impact and including impact on policy, I think provided a kind of high-level framing that there hadn't been in the policy landscape before. And then in the last 5 years, we've also seen quite a lot of different funder investments going into this space, which is encouraging. Although if I were really nitpicking, I'd say it might be nice to see more of a kind of strategic join-up between some of those investments, because the risk now is we've got lots going on and not so much coordination. But still, it's really exciting, but it doesn't mean that there are not sort of cold spots. It doesn't mean that we don't have to think about that better coordination and avoiding fragmentation. No, look, there's our timeline. I forgot to put that on there. And this is also, again, an interactive map of the ecosystem, which I think at least Brendan might have played with already, which is, if you really want to get nerdy and try and look at how this stuff all connects, this is our first attempt at doing this, and it won't be the last, because the ecosystem really is kind of changing and getting more complex all the time. But where we are now, I think, is with some efforts in almost every bit of the policy-making system across the UK now to put in place some kind of initiative to support engagement with academic research. Some of those are very well established, like the Chief Scientific Advisor Network. Some are much newer. For example, the Mayor of West Yorkshire, about 12 or 18 months ago, created a West Yorkshire Scientific Advisory Group. But I think it's really encouraging that we're seeing this now across the policy making ecosystem. But as we've heard about really eloquently, so I'm not going to kind of rehearse it all, there are still these really persistent barriers, and that ranges from the very practical things around funding and just know-how and how you do it and getting into that black box. But also I think, you know, those cultural barriers about lack of understanding, not speaking the same language, finding it hard to make the time for this because it's seen as an add-on, it's not part of your job. And also I think it's something that everybody can do if they want, but just because you want to do it doesn't follow you can automatically do it. So we do need to think about what are the skills that you might need to work in this way, what are the capabilities that you need. And the other dimension for me, I think, is as we think about some of those barriers, you realise it's not enough to just be a single institution trying to do this. Actually, you need to be thinking in terms of the system. So, you know, I probably spent 5 years at UCL, I think, just thinking, how on earth do I do anything with this big beast of an ungovernable, complex institution? But although it's fairly easy if you're at UCL, partly because we're in London, so we're near some of those central policy-making structures, it's fairly easy to sort of do work to build engagement. We also start to hear more and more, you know, UCL's great, but we want to talk to other universities too. And in fact, actually, sometimes I don't want to be seen talking to UCL because it might look like favouritism. And so I started to think more and more, I suppose, about how we might work more in partnership with other universities. We started to do a lot more convening, which sounds a bit glib, we said was by UCL, but not for UCL. So to deliberately bring in much wider academics. And that was really successful. But it was also really enjoyable. So that's why we really came up with the idea of CAPE. It was the idea of, is there a more collaborative way to do this? So we're not kind of, 20 different universities all kind of jostling for our access to government, but we're actually thinking about how to work together. But it was also thinking about that kind of black box question, thinking about how could we know really what sort of interventions were likely to be effective in the policymaking system. And then UPenn, I suppose, was a further development of that because it's really about trying to provide a collective and streamlined interface for policymakers. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about both now. I've got a lot of material on CAPE, so I'll probably go quite quickly. I'm very happy for you to stop me if anything, you just think, what? But I hope we'll have time for discussion at the end as well. So this is an overview. We worked in the end with kind of 60 formal policy partners on different collaborative projects. We were testing a number of different mechanisms. So we delivered 70 policy fellowships over the course of CAPE. We had about 30 seed-funded projects. We had 90 kind of knowledge exchange events, roundtables, workshops, dialogues, those sorts of things. And we also had some more strategic projects where we kind of worked in a very deliberate and deliberative way with some of our key policy partners, both in national government and parliament and regional government. We developed the mechanisms really building on that kind of learning by doing from UCL. So these are all things that we tried in different ways at UCL, and we were interested to see, could you deliver them collaboratively? We worked as a kind of single interface team. Could you deliver them in different contexts, at different institutions, with different levels of the policymaking system? So this was really an attempt to try all of that. We were really broad, and we didn't have to sort of take a view from the outset. If there was a policy demand for it, we did it. And the whole point really was to try and see how robust these mechanisms might be as ways to support policy engagement. So fellowships are really about building not just mobility, but mutual understanding, getting people to know each other's worths. The seed funding had two streams. One was a collaboration scheme, which was all about bringing people together. So the entire project could just be about building collaboration. We didn't sort of ask for, fancy outcomes. We didn't ask for changing the world. We just said, we want to know you've got somebody you're going to work with, and they fed into this project. And we also had a policy challenge strand, which solicited different challenges and needs from policymakers and asked people to respond. And as an aside, that worked really well, but only when we'd done the groundwork in building the relationships first. It didn't work as a cold calling thing. We did different things with training. We rapidly discovered that there was quite a plethora of training schemes in universities. And actually, there wasn't a need for more, but there was maybe a need to try and understand together how effective they were. So in a university sense, actually what we did was create a community of practice to share. different approaches to training. But we did do a very intensively co-developed training programme with, I think, what we were then calling the Department for Levelling Up, but thank God we're now calling the Ministry for Housing and Communities again. And that was really, really instructive in terms of building something over time with the officials we were trying to reach. And then we did a whole load of things around knowledge exchange, which we rapidly realised for our policy partners were providing a kind of a safe space to test new ideas, to think a bit differently, and sometimes just to get them time out of the office and out of the day job. So they valued them in and of themselves, regardless of the outcomes, which I found really instructive and a bit surprising, to be honest, in a good way. And then we also discovered there was this demand for us to convene networks around these new emerging kind of knowledge brokerage roles in policy making, both at the national government level and at local and regional government. And then alongside all that, we had an independent evaluation led by Catherine Oliver and Annette Boas, who are really well established in this field. And as a team, we were thinking all the time about our own learning, about our kind of shared practice and what was coming out of it. In a very sort of inductive sense, I suppose, and trying to gather case studies, not so much, I mean, we do use them a little bit. In fact, I'm probably going to do it in a second, to do the snazzy show off, didn't we do something great? But the real value of our case studies was trying to tease out, how did this happen? That sort of journey that Brendan was talking about. And then, these are some of the more strategic projects, I think, of them that we were able to do, where we kind of saw that there was a big need and thought, right, we're going to go for this. And the reason I highlight them is that for quite a lot of what we did through CAPE, we did some really interesting work, and then the funding dried up, or, our available resource had to move on. And we were left with, having done a great project, we were generally left with very strong relationships, which is brilliant. But whatever the activity, whatever the work had been, tended to stop. So the things that I think have really endured are the things where we managed to kind of embed it in structures in some ways, which sounds a bit boring, but I just think it's really, really important. So being able to not just test this idea of areas of research interest, which started within national government, but actually find a way to kind of embed them in different policy organisations means that agenda is growing and growing and growing. UPenn's doing more work on it all the time. But also thinking about what are the structures that were needed at regional government level. And at the time, we were just starting to see, I suppose, devolution of government within England starting to happen. But nobody was really thinking about what that meant in terms of having new combined authorities, having capacity for them to use evidence or engage with academics, or even kind of talk to their local universities somehow. So thinking about how we could create that kind of capacity, I think, was really important. And in terms of what we found overall, we still don't really know enough, I think, about what's definitely effective in terms of training. But this point about making it action-oriented and giving people the tools to kind of embed it in their day jobs is my big takeaway, which won't be a surprise, I don't think, to anybody who's done training. And at UCL, we're putting this into practice now with the Knowledge Brokerage Academy, where the curriculum really has been designed around plugging into what people are already doing rather than giving them a new thing to do. We also found that there's lots of appetite and principle for kind of co-created toolkits, but if you don't put resource around them, and if you can't provide like dedicated facilitation, then they tend to drift to the bottom of the to-do list. Seed funding, I think it's not surprising in a way that everybody said, yeah, seed funding is great. I mean, why wouldn't they say that? But what people said time and time again was how much the flexibility of the funding really mattered and how rare that was for them to be able to apply for a small amount of money and not sort of have to justify it massively in advance and to set out a slightly more experimental approach. So I think that's really interesting. And we asked them to think about what the problem was they were trying to address. But we also said, we don't expect you to set out exactly how you're going to address it. What we want you to do is find a way to work with partners and then do that together through the project. Knowledge exchange events, it was this idea, I think, of providing space for thinking. It was also really useful, I think, to be able to bring different actors together across the system. And we've heard a little bit about that, the importance of that earlier today, I think. But I think I had to learn in particular that it's not, you shouldn't see it as a trivial thing. Oh yeah, we'll do a workshop for you, we'll do it next week. You know, you do have to actually put the prep time in, and you have to put in the time to follow up and sort of check in with people. That conversation you had with X, how did that go? You know, that idea you were going to take forward. Can we do anything to help? Because at the time we had this, you know, flexible resource to do it. And then policy fellowships. Our policy hosts love them. Again, perhaps unsurprisingly. So lots and lots of demand, lots and lots of value coming out. And one of the things that surprised me most actually was that the thing that policy organisations hosting academic research has really valued was just the opportunity to create new networks and relationships and get to know a little bit more about research. I think I had wrongly and perhaps unfairly assumed they might be a bit more transactional. They would want a specific output and a thing out of it. And they often got that, but it wasn't the thing they were pointed. They would say, yeah, that was really useful. But what was really great was making this connection with Caroline and then finding out all the amazing colleagues she works with. And then they put me in touch with something else. So it was that kind of, you know, relational snowballing that they really valued. But again, I think the resource needed to do them properly just shouldn't be underestimated. And I would definitely say now what I would not have said to you 10 years ago, which is far better to do 1 or 2 policy fellowships properly and feel that you're managing it than to try to do 10 on a shoestring, which is how I started. And then in terms of our independent evaluation, the things they really emphasised, I think, were the need for infrastructure, for capacity, as both an enabler where it was there, but a hindrance where it wasn't. And the thing that stood out for me in terms of what people said was just the importance of being able to work in a much more flexible way, really. And I think an increasing sense that that is harder and harder to do in the academic community, to kind of work flexibly, to not have to have everything kind of planned out and mapped out and workload accounted for at every minute. We produced, not another toolkit, 8 or 9 different toolkits, but they were very practically focused. We thought of them as how-to guides. We co-created them with our policy partners, which I think was important. And they have all really just drawn from and distilled the kind of the learning through practice that we did. They've had about 6,500 downloads. Well, as of the end of 2024, I'm not up to date. So people are using them, we think. We've had some good feedback. I'm almost positive that some of them will now be out of date. So another challenge for UPenn will be looking at where we might update some. We published a number of reports. These were slightly more ad hoc, but they were picking up things that we thought were interesting that were coming out in terms of questions for the broader ecosystem. So, you know, what's the role and what are the competences of knowledge mobilisers? This question of how we build the capacity for evidence use at regional level, and also a survey of both academics and professional staff in universities on their experience of academic policy engagement, from which the standout finding was the utter commitment and enthusiasm of people for doing it, and their kind of utter despair at how hard it was to do. So, you know, this sense that it was being done despite rather than because of their university and the system they were working in. And if you just want the kind of the bite-sized version, so you don't have to read any of those reports or the final report, this is really what we learn on a slide. So that point about the importance of having both individual capacity and capability, but also seeing it as an institutional thing as well. And I think too often in our conversations, we perhaps focus on one or the other, but I think they go hand in hand and they're reinforcing. That capacity is also what enables you to work in that demand-led and very agile way that I think you need to. We didn't do anything that wasn't in response to policy demand, but we also found ourselves changing tack an awful lot as policy needs shifted or the project sort of went off in a different direction. And it's very hard to work, I think, with agility if you kind of don't have underlying capacity to do so. We've already heard a lot about trusted relationships and how important they are and working in that relational way. I think I can't overemphasize that enough, but it also needs to come with a health warning, because the danger of a relational approach, particularly in a country like the UK, is you effectively end up with an old boys network doing everything. So there's a sort of constant tension between recognising, you know, the pragmatic truth, I think, a need for a relational approach, but then thinking about how you also embed more diversity. And then the point about collaboration, I think, is just so important because it really was an enabler of our engagement. Working as a collaboration opened doors for us with policymakers, who said quite bluntly, we wouldn't have been able to do this if it was just you, UCL, or if it was just you, Cambridge, or just you, Manchester, but we can do it because you're all working together. That was really enlightening for me. It also, for the team, made it a lot easier. They could support each other, they could pass the baton, they could move things around. We were all learning by doing, and doing that as part of a kind of small peer cohort is a lot less lonely. So that was really important as well, I think. And then I guess finally, if you're doing that sort of embedded collaboration with your policy partners all the time, that you're constantly checking in with them, addressing their needs. You've not gone off into your academic ivory tower unwittingly. So keeping that kind of collaboration very live was really important. But there's always things you could do differently. And I think the realisation, I suppose, about the need for kind of capacity, enabling conditions came a bit late, perhaps, throughout the project. I don't think we'd anticipated spending so much of our kind of time and effort on how to do that. So if I were doing it again, I would definitely embed it from the start, and I would probably give us a longer sort of run-in time. But we started in April 2020, which was not ideal. As I said, we definitely worked at kind of scale and breadth, but I think because of that kind of recognition that you really need to find the structures and the processes and the bits of the system you can hang things on, I would have liked to have done more, at least a few more deeper sort of partnerships and projects, and also had more time to kind of stimulate that supply side interest. We were so relentlessly focused on the policy demand side. We didn't have as much time, I think, to kind of scope the demand amongst our academic communities and join the two together. We were a bit more responsive. And ideally, I think I would have liked us to be a bit more convening. And we had this, evaluation activity led by two leaders in their field, which was great. But if I was we kept it at arm's length, so that it felt independent and objective. I think the problem with that is it kind of hindered our ability to learn as we went along. We weren't able to draw from the insights. So with UPenn, for example, we've embedded the evaluation from the start. And our evaluator kind of sits with us in all our big strategic discussions and has helped us define our success metrics, all of those things. And he's very, very good at pointing and saying very gently, might just need to watch that, which I'm finding so valuable. So UPenn set up, because of this emerging demand from policymakers, particularly at the national level in the UK, not only for a sort of single interface, so they didn't have to pick up the phone to 20 universities every time they had a need, but also as a response, I think, to the fact that this was an emerging agenda. There's very few of us who were doing it. We started this in a room at UCL. We were all feeling a bit lonely, didn't really know what we were doing. It's quite nice to find that there are a few other people doing it. And that sense of UPenn kind of providing peer support, being somewhere that people can come and find their tribe, which is what I think about it and what I hear a lot, is really important. But the official reason is meeting that policy need for a streamlined interface. So I started with a handful of universities. In about 6 or 7 years, we've grown to 120 members, not only universities. But all of this has been done until now on a bit of a shoestring with a very small operating budget and a half-time network manager. So we've really been driven by the enthusiasm and the energy of our networks. It's been a kind of self-forming and organic network. And the reason I'm emphasising that is because, again, I think that's really powerful, and it just shows you the kind of appetite that there is in universities, I think, to do this sort of work and to work together on it. And that's really important because we're all so used to being told we have to compete with each other. So I think finding a space where people are willing to be collaborative and to work as a collective is really, really powerful. And it can deliver quite a lot, actually. And this is a bit silly, but I just think if you can get your organisation into the official guidance published by the GCSA as a good route for engagement, that feels to me like, those little wins that you just want to take. That was my little win 2 weeks ago. I thought, great. But now we're no longer a shoestring organisation, although I'm still having to, pinch myself. So we have a lovely UKRI award, plus some institutional match funding, which is enabling us to think much more seriously about what it takes to provide what we've called, in very jargony terms, a national connective infrastructure. But how do we deliver that kind of interface that was the inspiration for UPenn at scale across the UK so that it's drawing and mobilising knowledge from every university, large and small, and so that it's able to work effectively with policymakers to understand their needs, understand how to put them in touch with academic evidence and expertise. So we have 3 broad aims, which won't surprise you, I don't think, given what I've just said. So strengthening those connections and putting in place the kind of structures and processes that can do that. So developing that as part of UPenn's offer is going to be really important. But also a kind of a really key focus on building both capacity and capability. And ultimately, we think we might be able to drive a bit of systems change. I mean, this is definitely the kind of thing you put in a bid to impress your funder. But if we can pull all this off and we can do it with partners in the broader ecosystem, I think we might at least be able to point the way. 9 university partners, 5 kind of intermediary or policy-facing organisations, and a 4-year project timeline with a startup phase, which was really important for just giving us time to breathe, get stuff set up, but also a sort of consolidation and legacy phase to avoid that cliff edge where you stop your project and you suddenly realise there's still lots of things to do. And 3 main focus areas. So firstly, thinking about how we build capacity for people in universities, also people in policy organisations, looking at what more is needed in terms of professional development, but also looking to try and challenge institutions really to think about what are the things that they need to have in place to support this work. Thinking about this, I suppose it's a growing agenda in the UK, and I don't know if it's the same in Ireland, but, the place agenda, place-based policy making, I think increasingly important, increasingly where government is actually putting a lot of its, national government, a lot of its attention and energy in terms of kind of policy frameworks, but also funding. But we don't really know anything about the evidence needs of different places. We don't really know anything about what structures work where. So that's the idea of this area of focus. And then finally, which is, I suppose, my main nerdy but necessary interest, is how do we build this work as sustainable practice? So how do we understand how to do it effectively, how to do it collectively, how to do it in partnership with others, and how do we bring in other voices as well, which chimes with what Cormac was saying as well, because I think my worst outcome from all of this is that we invent something very clever and very technocratic and very top-down and centralised. That's absolutely not the point. So I'm really pleased we're working with the Young Foundation in the UK, who are real experts in kind of community engagement. So that is quite a lot for us to be thinking about. But it's not all we need to be thinking about, because there's still, I think, really difficult and intractable challenges. I think we've heard in different ways, actually, from everybody today, this kind of question about how do you make the time for this? How do you make the mental space for it? How do you find the energy for it? And that's hard to do, I think, because a lot of this work is invisible or it's delivering intangible impact. So it's quite hard to sometimes say, you really need to just let me spend a day a week for the next 2 years having coffees with people, so I can build my relationships, or, thinking about this really difficult thing with people. I firmly believe we should be doing that, but I can tell you my boss would not sign off on that if he knew how much of my time I spend doing that. Caroline, you talked about the multiple forms of evidence, and I'm going to come back to that. Because I also just really want to, again, it's boring, I'm sorry, but I emphasise this point about not having the processes in place to support this work. That kind of, in all busy organisations like universities, those processes, I think, drive how we behave, they drive how we work. You see this in policy organisations too. So if we don't have them in place to support us and to kind of make that time and space, then that's what I think we really have to kind of grasp the nettle on. Talked about relationships. I think the point about policy demand is interesting, and actually something I really took away from working on the International Public Policy Observatory, which is an ESRC project, Economic and Social Research Council project, set up in COVID initially to try and scan evidence and synthesise it, is how hard it is actually to scope policy demand. It's not that hard to kind of find big ticket policy makers, need to find a pathway to net zero. It's really hard to find the thing in that is the thing that you might be able to work with them on, the thing that you might be able to make progress on. And I think it's very easy to overlook this is your point, Cormac, really, the time that it can take to really, really narrow down that kind of policy demand. And increasingly, I think we all realise this isn't a bilateral endeavour anymore. It needs to be multilateral, and we need to be working across the system, across different sectors, across different disciplines, all of those sorts of things. For the UK in particular, I think there are also these, you can tell I'm a bit obsessed with this at the moment, I think, but there are these two, I think, sort of new ideas floating around in our policy ecosystem. This is going to require us to think quite differently, I think, because we have a relatively mature sort of scientific advisory structure in the UK at the national level, and then nothing below that. And I also think that the idea that somebody like Patrick Vallance, who was our former chief scientific advisor, and now very gratifyingly our science minister, because it's always good to have a science champion in those roles, he was always very clear on this kind of objective purity. You know, my role is to advise, it's to provide the evidence, it's to make sure policymakers understand the evidence, and then it's to leave it there and edge away. And I have some sympathy with that. But I just think some of the challenges that we're facing today and some of the ways we need to work in terms of integrating, I'll go to my next slide, integrating different forms of evidence and thinking about how you have bottom-up and citizen-driven approaches as well. I don't think it's always going to be enough to just edge away from the nice pile of evidence that you've just communicated. I think sometimes we're going to have to be willing to just roll our sleeves up a little bit, think much more about this as an endeavour of co-creation. And that's quite challenging, and it's not comfortable at all. And it raises all sorts of really profound questions about values and bias. But I just feel that this is the space, that messy space Brendan was talking about, that we need to move into. And this really matters, I think, because if we don't have this kind of this Hannah, who worked in the Welsh Senedd, but another colleague of mine, Hannah Durant at the Wales Centre for Public Policy, have both talked about evidence mosaics, which I really love as an idea of bringing together those different insights. But it's not easy, right? You can't just say, you know, here's a load of different kinds of evidence. So how do you integrate it? How do you respond to the kinds of different policy demands that you might be seeing? So if you're working with the DfE, they will want to see probably different forms of evidence from, say, the Treasury or from the Department for Work and Pensions. The Irish equivalents for those, which I don't know. Sorry, I'm just realising I'm giving you English names again. So I think that's a real challenge. And again, that's why I think we're going to need to be prepared to think, how do we integrate those and what are their implications for policymaking and what does it say about where you might go next? And that's both about eliminating the problem, but I think it is about trying to co-create some of the solutions. Final slide, I promise, because I've cantered through. This is my prescription, really, for what we need to do to get better at this. And most of it, I think, is probably summed up in my current obsession, which is this idea of connected infrastructure. So in the UK, UPenn provides some of this. There are other organisations providing it. But what we don't have is a sense that this needs investment, you know, across the university sector. We need to see government departments investing in this. We need to see local government. You know, every organisation, I think, needs some level of this connective infrastructure or relational infrastructure. And that's because it's the glue that sustains our relationships. It's the glue that kind of holds engagement together between specific projects and specific interactions. It's also the glue that does some of the sort of very practical, hard slog work, finding the opportunities and responding and managing processes and trying to find ways around them. And I think it's also the thing that is sort of holding up some of those kind of informal and invisible things that Brendan mentioned earlier. And I guess really what it means is you need people with time. It's really simple. And you can look at that in different ways, I think. You can think it's about dedicated knowledge mobiliser roles. So, you know, I have a very tiny team at UCL doing that. But I think it's also actually about saying, if you're an academic researcher and you want to do this, then we will make time for you to do it. We won't expect you to do it on top of, you know, the massive job you're already doing. So I don't think we should see knowledge mobilisation as something only a certain set of people do. I think we should see it as something anybody can do if they're supported and enabled to do it. And that's how we build this kind of connective infrastructure. And ultimately, I think it really matters because if we don't have this, then we're not going to be able to work in that kind of multi-sector, multi-actor collaborative way. We're going to carry on having this patchy approach where some things work really well and some things don't. And where probably, you know, institutions like UCL will continue to be able to engage with public policy, but other universities don't. And I just don't think that is good enough. given the urgency of the challenges we face.